I think a lot of people in this country would agree that the NHS is one of our great achievements as a nation. When Americans criticise the NHS, as sometimes they do, I think they're profoundly ignorant of its origins, and it was one of the things that we did almost in tribute to the generation that went through the Second World War. There was a feeling after the Second World War that the nation had suffered together and been through the worst times imaginable, rich and poor alike, and it was time to do something for everybody, that no one should be left behind, that no one should fall ill and not be able to afford healthcare. I think it's a wonderful principle. And Greens are not just committed to the NHS being free at the point of use, but we're also committed to it being fully within the public sector. Now, private business is a wonderful thing. It can produce great innovations and solve lots of problems, but fundamentally, businesses need to be driven by profit. And there are considerations like commercial confidentiality, and those don't sit well with running a transparent healthcare system which is all about the well-being of patients. Commercial confidentiality gets in the way of proper oversight and transparency, and profit gets in the way of the well-being of patients being the major consideration. So for Greens, it's non-negotiable. We want the NHS to be publicly owned and free at the point of use. We'd also like to see closer attention paid to some of the things that put pressure on the NHS. Now, we're spending at least 20 billion a year picking up the tab for people who are suffering from heart disease and diabetes and obesity. And it's an increasingly big problem in the UK. And a growing body of medical opinion is also concerned that things like dementia might also be related to conditions like diabetes, or in fact another form of diabetes. Some medics refer to dementia as type 3 diabetes. And this suggests that a lot of this is down to how we live our lives, what we eat, and the amount of exercise we do, the fact that we're increasingly sedentary. Now, some of that we can address by encouraging people to be more active, not spend so much time sitting down. I spend a lot of time sitting down. I know I shouldn't. Some of it is about what we eat. And we don't want to be telling people, lecturing people that they have to eat healthily the whole time. But many of us, I think, take for granted that the food that we eat when we go out and buy convenience food, because that's how we increasingly have to live life in a very busy world, that it is produced so it is good for us. We are effectively subsidizing the food industry for producing food which is not good for us in many respects. It's not just a case of exercising sensible choices and not eating 10 packets of donuts. However lovely the idea of eating 10 packets of donuts is, and you know, I'm as susceptible to a donut as the next guy. We don't have time as consumers to check everything we do. We want to be able to take things on trust, and we need a food industry which is capable of being trusted. And we cannot subsidize, because that's essentially what's happening, we cannot subsidize a food industry to produce bad food by picking up the tab when it makes people ill. So we need to rein in the food industry and make sure that they are meeting sensible standards about the kind of things that we find ourselves having to pick up for lunch when we're nipping out from work or grabbing something to feed children or our parents or what have you. So we can trust that it's good for us. It's not a lot to ask. And I think part of this is rooted in the fact that for the last 50 years we've run what is essentially a cheap food policy. Now, everybody should be able to afford and have access to good, healthy food. Cheap doesn't have to mean bad, and just as expensive doesn't necessarily mean good. But the food industry needs to play its part. We subsidised the tobacco industry for years by looking after people who become ill through smoking. We still subsidise the drinks industry by looking after people who become ill through drinking. And at least both of those are taxed, so to some extent the costs the NHS incurs are met. That's not happening with food, and it needs to.